afternoon and welcome to the final session of our preparatory lecture series in the run-up to COP26, which is of course no longer true. Now this is a post-COP26 roundtable, and I'm really grateful for all the speakers who have already joined us for a morning session and now are joining us here for the afternoon session to share some reflections, very early reflections on the outcome of COP26 and CMA3. And I'm really delighted that you are willing to give your time away to share your insights after reading all these many documents and really doing some very important work there over these 2 weeks. And as you know, this is a jointly organized lecture series with Niloufar Oral, who is the director of the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore, and also Christina Vogt, who is a professor of law at the University of Oslo and the co-chair of the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee, and also the chair of the IUCN and World Commission on Environmental Law, who are also co-organizers of this series. And some of you have been with us during the entire lecture series before COP, and I've said this a couple of times. I'm really delighted to see that the recordings have also been useful for many, and this will again be recorded. And the procedure of today will be that we are starting with Professor Bodansky now, who you will have seen in the lecture series, professor of law, joining us from the US, where it is early in the morning. And because he is traveling later in the afternoon, we will also take questions for Dan before we then move on to discuss Linda on loss and damage, and then Selam on adaptation. And Amir Sokolovsky is also joining us, who had already a session in the morning with us. And I will introduce and say a few more words about our following speakers. But I will give the floor now first to Dan. So over to you. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. And I gave the opening talk in the spring, providing a very broad overview of what to expect at COP26 and how to judge success. And so I thought my reflections now post-COP26 would be in a similar vein. So this is the view from 30,000 feet or 10,000 meters. A very broad overview. And I thought what I would do, since I actually was not able to attend COP26, so I wasn't able to follow some of the issues as closely as I might have if I'd been there, I would try to provide a pretty broad assessment as to how Paris is doing. Is Paris working now 6 years into the Paris process? And I think how well you think Paris is working, of course, depends on what your expectations were when Paris was initially agreed. So if you, depending on how your expectations were initially, that will, of course, depend on how you think it's doing now. So let me give what I consider to be a brief report card on Paris during my presentation. And so I guess I think there really were, in my view, when Paris was adopted, 7 or 6 different features of Paris that I was looking at. One was, to what degree is it successful in shaping normative expectations going forward? A second is the whole idea of the Paris Agreement, in my view, was to create political moments every 5 years, at which time there would be significant focus on climate change. There would be a lot of pressure on states and other actors to do more to address climate change. Everyone agreed that the initial round of NDCs that were adopted or put forward in Paris in 2015 were insufficient, that there was a significant gap between those pledges and what would be necessary to keep temperature increase to well below 2 degrees and aspirational 1.5 degrees. So the idea was to create political moments going forward. A third thing I think when Paris was adopted was what would happen with the Paris rulebook. Paris established some pretty broad guidelines, some pretty broad rules, and so it needed to be fleshed out in much more specific rules. And I think one of the questions, for me at least, when Paris was adopted was there really agreement in Paris, or was it just sort of a compromise and everybody would keep on fighting over the same issues post-Paris? And would the Paris Agreement really stick, or would the Paris rulebook in some ways represent a walk back from what was agreed to in Paris? Then the fourth was, this relates to the creating political moments, progressively increasing ambition, the so-called ratchet mechanism or ambition mechanism. A fifth was to provide support. And of course, the overall objective in terms of mitigation, reduce emissions, and keep temperature increase to well below 2 degrees with a 1.5 degree aspirational goal. So I have a fairly optimistic, probably of the panelists this morning, or this morning my time, I have the most optimistic assessment of Paris, perhaps because my expectations for Paris were not so high. The issue of equity, for example, has been a persistent question in the climate regime since it was first, the negotiations first began back in 1990. So we're 30 years on. We haven't, I think, made a lot of progress in getting agreement on what equity means. I guess I never thought that the Paris Agreement and the Paris process was going to lead to greater agreement as to what equity would do. I had limited views about what Paris could actually achieve in terms of the issue of loss and damage and adaptation. So this report card is a pretty optimistic report card because I guess my expectations for Paris or my hopes for Paris were largely focused around the idea of creating political moments, progressively ratcheting up ambition, having a relatively strong transparency system to promote ambition and accountability. Those were sort of my expectations or my hopes for Paris. So I'm going to go through these different features. So I have the 7 features. I have an extra credit item here for the methane and deforestation pledges, which were really on the sort of sidelines of the official part of the meeting, the formal part of the meeting in Glasgow. Let me go through these 7 and try to explain a little bit why I gave these grades. So the first is shaping expectations. And here I think Paris has been remarkably successful. The Paris Agreement had the well below 2 degree temperature goal, but then it had the aspirational goal of 1.5 degrees. That was sort of the stretch goal. That has now really become the expectation or the normative expectation of the international community. One of the key goals of the British presidency of COP26 was to keep 1.5 degrees in reach. I don't know if that really was successfully achieved, although they said it was. But the 1.5 degree expectation, I think, has really now become the norm. It's sort of replaced the well below 2 degrees objective as the goal of the Paris process. And I think in addition to that, the idea that there should be mid-century net zero goals has also really had surprisingly impressive uptake. The Paris Agreement provides for or calls for net zero emissions in the second half of the century, so somewhere between 2050 and 2100. But now, increasingly, I think there's agreement that it should be as close to 2050 as possible. Countries should have that as their objective to get to net zero. So a lot of countries now have already put forward 2050 net zero objectives. China has a 2060 objective. India put forward at Glasgow a 2070 objective. But there's, in terms of the expectation as to when countries will get to net zero, we're now at the early end of the range that Paris provided for, the 2050 to 2100 range. And I think, again, that's an impressive achievement of Paris in terms of sort of shaping how actors are going to judge whether Paris is actually successful or not, that we could keep temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, we get to net zero as close to mid-century as possible. On the second issue, creating political moments, again, I guess I had some skepticism as to whether this theory would really work, that every 5 years, as a result of the stock take and the new round of NDCs that were called for in the Paris Agreement, that would really achieve these political moments like Paris, that would get countries to really step up and pledge to do more to address emissions of greenhouse gases. So I think Glasgow, again, to my mind, was more successful than I was expecting. There was a huge number of leaders there. Of course, China's leader was not present, but that was, I think, as much due to COVID as to anything else. there was a huge amount of attention given to the Glasgow conference. Literally millions, tens of millions of news stories on it. In the US, it was the first time on the nightly news that it was the featured item every day of the conference, sort of led off with what was happening in Glasgow. And this is a tremendously greater amount of attention than previous COPs have gotten, at least certainly in the US. And a number of countries, both in the lead up to Glasgow and at Glasgow itself, did put forward new NDCs. And then in addition, I give it an A- because the NDCs still are, of course, well short, but they nevertheless represent some, I think, progress in terms of emission reductions. And you can see the political moment established in Glasgow, in part from COP participation. I think Glasgow set a record. I'm not sure the actual numbers who came, but in terms of the number of participants who registered to come, it was the highest of any of the COPs, including the Paris COP, COP21. So it had a huge amount of participation. Finishing the Paris rulebook, again, I guess Glasgow, in my view, was about as successful as one could hope for. The three main loose ends in the Paris rulebook that weren't wrapped up in Katowice were all, to some degree, wrapped up. Article 6, there were decisions adopted on both the Article 6.2 mechanism, the internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, as well as Article 6.4. Article 13, common reporting tables and tabular formats were both agreed to. On common timeframes, there was no specific decision on common timeframes, but in the cover decision, countries were strongly encouraged to have 5-year timeframes. So I guess there was at least some movement on the common timeframe issue in terms of the cover decision. So I think one of the questions I had, certainly, and Lavanya Rajmani and I wrote an article, 2 articles about this a couple of years ago, was whether or not the sort of somewhat tenuous compromises that were agreed to in Paris would stick. The idea that contributions would be nationally determined, the nuanced approach to differentiation that was adopted, and so forth, whether that would be fully reflected in the rulebook. And I think the rulebook does strike the same kind of balance that we find in the Paris Agreement. So the rulebook, in a sense, is true to the kinds of compromises that we see in the Paris Agreement itself. So I give that an A- here. In terms of ratcheting up ambition over time, of course, the pledges that were put forward pre-Glasgow and in Glasgow still fall well short. But if you look, there's significant, I think, improvement. There's significant increase in ambition. So the idea that there will be a ratchet up over time, I think is that approach is to some degree working. Pre-COP, the pledges and targets were projected to achieve 2.6 degrees temperature increase. The pledges and targets that were made by the time that the Glasgow conference ended, improved that by 0.5 degrees centigrade, which I think is significant. In addition to the actual NDCs that were put forward, then there are also the mid-century or close to mid-century net zero targets that were put forward. So I give it a B, basically for the pledges, because they're, I think, definitely an improvement, but still fall well short of where we need to be. I sort of have the B+ as an alternative, because then if you add in the net zero pledges, that then leads to more ambition than simply the NDCs themselves. In terms of providing support, I give this the lowest grade. I give it probably a higher grade than a lot of people would give it. So a lot of people would say give this an F on providing support, because the developed countries did not meet their pledge in Copenhagen, and then again renewed in Paris to mobilize $100 billion in climate finance per year. They fell short of that. It was 80 billion, according to at least one estimate. There's a lot of controversy, of course, of what should count as climate finance, but 80 billion, I think, was the general view as to what's been provided. So that's short, but of course, when I grade an 80% score, an 80% score is not a failing grade. An 80% score is still a decent grade. So, but I gave it a C+ here. And then there was a lot of pressure on developed countries to up their game. And so there now is a sort of pathway to get to the $100 billion over the next 2 years. So while this is, I think, clearly the weakest element as to how Paris has been doing, still a significant increase in climate finance over the last half decade. So I think there's still progress that can be seen there. I gave the Glasgow conference some extra credit because in addition to what was going on the NDCs in terms of the political moment, in terms of expectations, in terms of finance, there were a number of significant announcements made in Glasgow that are sort of, in a sense, outside the formal structure of the Paris Agreement, but can contribute to achieving the Paris Agreement's goals, temperature goals. So the Methane Agreement, I think, is the most important one here because methane is a huge contributor to climate change, to global warming. It's approximately 80 times more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So a number of countries, significant number of countries, pledged to reduce their methane emissions by 30% by 2030. So if that actually is achieved, then that would be a significant effort. Now, I give it an A- because the fact that the pledge was made doesn't necessarily mean it will be achieved. Unlike the NDCs, which are subject to a lot of different transparency requirements, both in reporting what the NDC is and in terms of reporting on progress in achieving NDCs, the methane pledge doesn't have any of that infrastructure around it. So exactly what countries will do to achieve that, whether they are achieving that, right now at least, is outside the Paris framework. So I think one of the keys is going to be to try to bring the methane pledge into the Paris framework, into countries' NDCs, so that the reporting on the progress in achieving the pledge can be clearly tracked by other countries and by civil society observers. So I think the methane pledge is definitely a significant outcome from the Glasgow conference, but I think it's still, there's a lot of questions about it, particularly because it's not part of the Paris transparency framework infrastructure. Then, of course, the bottom line on mitigation is emissions. And so I give this an incomplete. We really won't know what the results are until 2025, 2030. If you look at annual CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, it continues to go up significantly. There was a significant drop in 2020 due to COVID, but now the emissions are bouncing back up again. So I think huge question mark still as to whether Paris is actually working. So the bottom line is it's been successful, in my view, in creating some expectations and creating a political moment in Glasgow and encouraging stronger NDCs and mid-century pledges, in encouraging some other initiatives like the methane pledge. But nevertheless, whether it actually is achieving emission reduction still remains to be seen. So that, of course, is by far the most important feature of judging the success of Paris. And I think we won't know that until the next 5 to 10 years, whether it's really bending the curve on emissions. So that's my sort of overall very brief assessment as to how Paris is doing. 6 years on. I guess it's doing about as well as I would have hoped for 6 years ago, but still, I think the questions that I had in Paris as to whether it would really make a difference still remain open questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan, for your insights. Very interesting. I absolutely like this rating system. It reminds me of, the grading that has to be done at this time of the year again as well. Very interesting. I've got a question, but I'm happy to rest mine and let everyone else go first. We agreed that in this session today, we start with some questions just for Dan because he needs to leave a little bit earlier. So if there are any questions, please go ahead. You can just speak, or if you don't want to speak, you can write in the chat and I will read it out, but you can also come in and ask your question.
I'm happy to be the rude Israeli that jumps in first when there's a silence.
Yes, please.
First of all, excellent way of looking at it. In many instances, I'm one of those that shares your optimism in terms of saying, how much could you expect from 200 politically motivated with their own interest people meeting? And I say that with the greatest affection and respect for them. There had to be a limit to our expectations, and it's up to us from here. I guess the question for me is, given that the 5-year cycle is broken, and I think that that's a good thing, or at least currently broken, how do you predict most of the action taking going ahead at the next stage? And I say that from the very biased position of I believe that the baton has now moved to a large extent to either the state or the non-state actors, sort of to the downwards and upwards as Paris, I think, had intended.
So, by the way, you mentioned at the end the non-state actors, and actually now that you mentioned that, I'm thinking my report card needs to include that, or perhaps in the extra credit, but it's really not extra credit because I think it's now increasingly built into the Paris structure, all of the race to zero activities of the climate champions. So there were the interstate announcements, so like the methane pledge, but then there were a lot of additional announcements by both coalitions of non-state actors and public-private partnerships. So I think that's actually another feature of the Paris process now that's important, and as you say, probably increasingly important going forward. And so I think that's an outcome from Paris, really, in a sense, that is encouraging. To what degree it actually leads to emission reductions remain to be seen, whether there's building the same kind of infrastructure to measure what the pledges actually mean that are being made, what specifically is being pledged, and how well the different actors who made the pledge are doing in achieving their pledge. I think all of that's a big open question, and I understand the Secretary General announced that he's going to be establishing an expert group to be assessing these pledges and try to provide some more rigor to the whole non-state actor pledging process, the race to zero kinds of things. So I guess I hadn't really thought that this was going to break we're a year delayed, of course, because of COVID with COP26, but I think the global stocktake, as I understand it, but I wasn't there, so maybe there was other discussions. Global stocktake timetable is still the same, and then the rounds of NDCs will be the same. So I guess I wasn't.
They are the same. Sorry, I meant in the fact that so the pressure was supposed to be increased. So those 5-year periods were also meant to create civil society pressure, and that was to be increased. But now that they've broken that down and you can submit at any stage, and the synth reports are going to be an annual thing as well, presumably there's an expectation of, but absolutely the global stock remains.
Yeah. Well, so I don't know the answer to that. I think one of the things I didn't mention that I probably should have on the NDCs was, in recognition of the fact that the NDCs pledged in Glasgow were insufficient, the cover decisions calls for countries to reconsider their NDCs next year. So now I think the problem with this is you can only have so many political moments. I mean, if every single COP becomes sort of when you can, as you say, make a new pledge, then you lose some of the focus that I think you had with Glasgow. So I think it's maybe a little bit of a double-edged sword if next year there's going to be an expectation you raise your NDCs, and then I have no expectation that the NDCs put forward in Sharm el-Sheikh will be sufficient to close the gap. So then, then if they do it the next year after that, in Qatar, I think is where it's going to be, if I remember right, then you sort of lose the, if everything always is an opportunity to have a new NDC or pressure, then I think you lose some of that special attention that you had in Glasgow. So I guess I'm not sure the answer to that. But I think having it be a periodic thing that comes out of the global stocktake was a key feature of Paris. And so I think that would be worth trying to preserve going forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sila?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. It's a different way of looking at Paris from my view, for example, but it's interesting on how you have presented the different gradings. But one could argue that Paris had 3 goals, right? So we had the temperature goal, the adaptation goal, and the finance goal. So it would also be interesting to hear more about how you see those goals being operationalized. And maybe in particular to the support component of the C+, it's very interesting on how you have put that. As you have noted from the covering decision, the language that has been used was a politically agreed language, which reflects on noting that there is a deep regret from developed country parties that they have failed to fulfill that pledge, right? This was a pledge of 2009, 100 billion that has not been fulfilled by 2020 and would most probably not be fulfilled by 2023. So I wondered how, I mean, of course, this is your view and this is your scoring, but it would be interesting to hear more about it. As you're also well aware, this year, the Standing Committee on Finance published their needs assessment report, which reflects that developing countries need 6 trillion not billion, trillion. And we're talking about ratcheting ambition, including specific, for example, Methane as a very specific language that was agreed at the covering decision. But it's important that if we are ratcheting up this course, there has to be also important consideration of how this support component is also provided. So it will be interesting to hear how you reflect on that, and maybe if it would have an impact in your future grading, because ambition might not be the same if there's no support provided to countries. Thank you.
Well, so thank you for that question. So those are obviously really important points that you're making. On the, just starting with the finance question, the $100 billion mobilization goal. So there's always a question in international environmental law as to how you rate progress or effectiveness, whether it's in terms of what's, how close you get to where you need to be ultimately, or how much progress you've made from where you start. And so if you're measuring progress, how much progress you've made from where you start, as opposed to how close you've gotten to where you need to be, you're going to get very different scores. So my approach was from where we started in 2015, how much have we moved since then? I think it's equally valid to your point of view as to where we need to get to, which is going to be in the trillions of dollars. Then we're obviously falling way, way, way short. So this is highly subjective. It never occurred to me that actually Paris was going to provide the kind of finance, was going to get to that goal. So I think I gave it a C+ because I guess I think there's been progress made. It's still, as you recognize, as you mentioned, well short of where we need to be. So in terms of the 3 goals, I focus, yes, very much on mitigation. So I'm reflecting a developed country point of view as a former developed country negotiator in the climate change process. So on the financial flows goal, so I think a lot of that is actually now taking place in the non-state actor sector. So there was the pledge by financial asset managers representing, I think, $130 trillion, supposedly, that we're going to redirect their investments in a climate-friendly way by 2050. So, what that means, how that's going to be tracked, all of those are big questions. But I think the 21C goal of making financial flows compatible with the other goals of the Paris Agreement is going to take place to a significant degree by private actors, by banks, investors, and so forth. So I guess I think the Mark Carney initiative, the outcome was definitely noteworthy. Whether it's going to work or not, I think, is an open question. On adaptation, I think that's where the climate change regime still has the, is the least effective. Adaptation, I've been going to climate meetings since 1991. Adaptation always gets short shrift in the negotiating process. There was an attempt in Paris to sort of elevate it, but still, if you look at the actual commitments in Paris on adaptation, there are really almost zero commitments relating to adaptation. Adaptation is largely about, in the Paris framework, about, I think, information sharing, capacity building, providing financial support. I think the cover decision saying that they were going to double financial support for adaptation, represents some progress on that issue. But I would agree with you, that's not, if I was grading that, I would give it a lower grade. Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Dan. I think I can't see at the moment more questions in the chat or so. So maybe I can ask the question that I would like to ask you. So something that came up actually in the morning session as well was that we see now more this 1.5 degrees Celsius target all across the decisions in recognizing the IPCC Working Group 1 report. Now, you also said this has now become a norm, and I would like to know how do we phrase that in terms of legally meaningful language? Is it now a new legal target? Now, the context for this is I've written in 2017 an article saying, well, looking at the temperature range target that the Paris Agreement sets forth, it would be possible for the CMA to set a different temperature target within that range and just simply go for the lower target. And I remember the reviewer writing back, you must be daydreaming. And, it was just playing with thoughts and legal possibilities. So it is a legal possibility in the remit of the CMA to say we will now have a more stringent target. Do you think that has happened? Because if that has happened, if we now can say legally there is an obligation to adopt a 1.5 temperature target when you calculate your national carbon budgets, that would mean that many states are in the wrong at the moment, because I know some states have used a medium value of 1.5 and 2 degrees. They've used 1.75 to calculate their remaining national targets, and then calculated their NDCs and their entire legal targets on carbon emissions in accordance with that. So if we say international law prescribes now a very concise target of 1.5 instead of the range, that would mean some states are now not obliging with international law.
Well, so I think your question raises the much more general question as to how we distinguish between international law, hard law, soft law, what we mean by international law. I use the term normative expectation rather than legal norm, because I think it does, there is an expectation now in terms of the way countries and other actors talk to one another. 1.5 degrees represents some kind of agreed view as to where we need to get to. So when we're assessing what countries are putting forward in their NDCs, their mid-century targets, all of that is against the backdrop as to whether it will keep temperature increase to under 1.5 degrees. I wouldn't call that a legal norm. The distinction is a fuzzy one between what we call a legal norm and not. It makes a difference if you're in court. So if it was before the ICJ or in a national court, And if 1.5 degrees was a legal norm, then a court might actually then assess the country's NDC against the 1.5 degree temperature goal to see whether or not it's adequate. So in countries where litigation like that is possible, I guess it would be up to national courts as to how they view that. I don't view that, in my view, as it's a legal norm. I don't think the CMA has the authority to set a new temperature goal. I think in the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 degree temperature goal was aspirational. In fact, even the well below 2 degrees temperature goal, in my view, isn't actually a legally binding norm. It's an overall aspiration as well, but it's in a sense a harder aspiration or a more definite aspiration than the 1.5, which was explicitly a reach or sort of an aspirational goal as opposed to just a goal. So there's sort of different levels of how strong or weak the normative expectation is. I think the normative expectation of 1.5 degrees is now a lot stronger than it was in Paris. I think in Paris, a lot of countries would have said it was purely aspirational, and now it's sort of become how we judge, evaluate NDCs, the adequacy of NDCs individually and overall. But I guess I wouldn't call it a legal norm, and I don't think that. Now, I think that doesn't make so much difference in most contexts unless you're actually in a judicial context where the distinction between hard law and soft law then does become very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I mean, absolutely. That was what I meant. So in a legal context, and I should add the article got published, but so for the Constitutional Court in Germany, that was the decisive factor, was the carbon budget calculated in a correct way? And they did criticize the medium value, but there was no way of saying this was against the law because, it's fine if you have a temperature range, if you then calculate the carbon budget in accordance with the medium range. But that could change. So it's a really interesting point. But I don't want to.
I wouldn't say it's hardened into a norm that I would be advising a court that they should be applying. Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, are there any other questions specifically for Darit? Otherwise, we could move to Linda.
Oh. I guess the question of loss and damage needs to be asked if you're on the panel and here to be asked, and that was
sure. So I think loss and damage sort of illustrates how the UN climate regime operates, which is it's a very slow, tortuous process where it's like trench warfare, I guess is the analogy I use, where there's sort of small advances and then pushback and so forth. But if you look at loss and damage, the arc, so we haven't made that much progress on loss and damage. Of course, the outcome in Glasgow was criticized by those who want financing for loss and damage. But if you look at the arc, there's been, I think, actually, in some ways, a significant movement over the last decade. So you've got to really look, it's glacial. You've got to look over a long time period to see the changes. But when I started following climate change back in 1990, there was nothing, loss and damage really didn't get anywhere. It didn't really get anywhere, particularly till, hello there, the newcomer here. So it didn't really get anywhere until Warsaw, when they established the Warsaw International Mechanism. So then, though, still sort of under the rubric of adaptation, or at least that was still the view. Then in Paris, we see another step where now loss and damage gets its own article separate from adaptation. But then there was the decision, the COP decision paragraph saying it's not a basis for liability and compensation. Well, now we begin to see references to finance for loss and damage, which, several years ago would have been, a complete red line for some countries. So we see this sort of slow process where, so my expectation would be, over the next 4 or 5 years, there will be some more movement in the direction of providing some financing for loss and damage, because that seems to be the sort of the trend line. It's like a rear guard action being fought to, slow down movement on loss and damage, but there's still some changes that are going on. There's still some arc, I think, to how that issue has been developing. So it would have astonished me if there'd been agreement to financing on loss and damage in Glasgow, but The fact that there's now going to be some discussions on that, I think, again, because I had, didn't expect much on that, to me was about as far as I could have imagined Glasgow going.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's really useful to have this insight of someone who's been with this process for a relatively long time, since the beginning, really, and maybe but who still believes in it. I think that's really important, because there are also some voices that are giving up on this entire process, and I think it does deliver. We just can't forget that ambition really needs to grow in every state as well. I think I would probably.
Yeah, if I could just say one last thing, it sort of has evolved. It evolves very slowly. And the question is, given the severity of the climate change problem, will it make enough progress fast enough to actually be successful? And I think that's very much an open question. Yeah, that's very true. But we've got more expertise now coming up on loss and damage as well, Amir. So I will thank you, Dan. It was really amazing to hear from you. And that doesn't mean now that you have to go. I just wanted to make sure I say that properly before you do switch off. And I wish you a really good special weekend as well. So thank you again for coming in here. And now we go to Linda, who will speak to loss and damage as well. Now, Linda has already been part in the lecture series and has given phenomenal lecture really on loss and damage already. And so she's an environmental lawyer who's been involved in the United Nations climate change negotiating process again since 2005, with a special focus on the issues of adaptation and loss and damage, especially associated with low-lying island states and small island states. And she's a doctoral candidate at UCL Laws and a real specialist in the entire climate change loss and damage question. So thank you very much, Linda.
Thank you, Petra, and hello, everyone. It's nice to be back again with this group of individuals and others who've been able to join. I hesitate being called a specialist on loss and damage, because I think we all do have our different perspectives, but I've been involved in the issue for quite a while. And I want to be rather agnostic at this point in terms of grades on outcomes and loss and damage in the process, at least for the beginning of my talk. And I don't have slides, so bear with me as I run through my notes. I do have a perspective on the outcomes, but before I provide my own personal perspective, I wanted to run through where I see where I've mapped out loss and damage can be found in the COP26 CMA3 outcomes, because I think it's important if we do want to push forward on the loss and damage envelope at where it is now, we need to understand the levers that we have to pull, certainly from a developing country perspective, to make more proactive and progressive steps in the future. So I thought I'd run through my mapping and then talk about where I feel positive and where I think some of my personal disappointments were at the end of the COP. So first of all, and I think this is fairly obvious, we have loss and damage in the covering decisions. They don't have numbers yet, but I'm going to call them one CP26 and one CMA3. That each of those covering decisions has a section on loss and damage. I'm not quite sure when the covering decision paradigm started, but we certainly had one in Katowice, and we had a covering decision approach in Madrid, and the Glasgow Climate Pact is kind of continuing that rather short tradition. And so if we look at that rather short tradition, this is the first time loss and damage has shown up as a separate section in a covering decision for a COP or for the CMA. I'll talk a little bit about the governance question and why the decisions around loss and damage look a bit strange. And most of the content has been shoved into the CMA side of the equation, whilst the governance decision, governance is being debated, but has been an attempt to mirror outcomes in both the COP and the CMA decisions. So what did we get out of the covering decisions? A reiteration of the urgency of scaling up action and support for loss and damage. This reiteration is a reiteration of the Madrid outcomes when we had the review, the 2019 review of the WIM. So nothing really new there. The sort of new thing that's come out of the covering decisions is this establishment of a Glasgow dialogue to discuss arrangements for funding activities to address loss and damage. A disappointment was expressed and this morning's roundtable about how there had been a call for a financial facility and what we got was more of an open-ended dialogue. I have some thoughts around the strategy and the timing of calling for this financial facility and why I believe it sort of ended up in an open-ended dialogue format. I think the positive aspect of the Glasgow dialogue is that it's putting a discussion on funding for loss and damage on the table. It's rather open-ended, as I said, because we don't really have there's no outcome articulated or provided for in the decisions. But what it does do is it allows us to discuss loss and damage and financing for loss and damage at every single session, not just year-end COP CMA sessions, every single session under the Climate Change Convention process through to June 2024. And this is something that many developing country parties have been calling for, is having loss and damage on the agenda at every session. And what this dialogue does, the way it's set up, is it allows for that. I think there's more that can be done, but I'll run through the rest of my mapping and then talk a little bit more about the detail. In the decisions that sort of start with looking at the reports of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, we've broadened out the discussion and talked about fleshing out the Santiago network for loss and damage, this network of organizations, bodies, networks, and experts to provide technical assistance to small developing countries, particularly vulnerable developing countries. We've had about a 2-year conversation informally guided by the 2 presidencies around the Santiago network. So the Santiago network and where we got to it, I think, was really ripe for decision at this COP, and parties were able to decide on the functions of the Santiago network and a process for agreeing the institutional arrangements between now and COP27. And those were considered certainly by many of my developing country colleagues as a fairly big win and a good outcome. Although it was a very time-consuming process, and I think, you know, from a negotiating strategy, if we negotiate things sequentially, you sometimes lose at, you know, you run out of time to cover it all, and part of the Glasgow dialogue outcomes, I think, had to do with that. Other things that this WIM decision have are encouraging the ExCom to continue working with the Standing Committee on Finance to provide guidance to the operating entities of the financial mechanism, and it's not just the GCF; it's also the GEF, and to continue being proactive in providing guidance around loss and damage and funding for loss and damage through the SCF. And I think that's an important element or lever going forward around climate finance for loss and damage. Then some more obscure, I think, areas that we need to consider in the decision on matters related to the SCF. And Selam mentioned that the SCF produced a report on the determination of needs for developing country parties. So that was addressed in this decision, and I'll talk about the specifics around loss and damage. But also in this decision, the 4th biennial assessment was addressed, and the key outcomes of the 4th biennial assessment were endorsed by the COP. And if you actually look at the 4th biennial assessment, it has quite a bit on loss and damage, and it talks about where our knowledge of loss and damage finance is and what more needs to be done. So in that endorsement is a tacit endorsement of looking at loss and damage finance. In the determination of needs report, there was a recognition that there are challenges in deriving cost estimates for addressing loss and damage needs. And one of the recommendations coming out of that report was an encouragement to parties and non-state actors to further develop methodologies to do this sort of cost estimation. And it includes academia, and I'm an academic, so there's an encouragement to all of us to continue looking at methodologies for actually estimating the costs of loss and damage. In the report of the GCF, there's a paragraph that encourages the board of the GCF to continue looking at ways to finance loss and damage. So specific instructions to the GCF. In the enhanced transparency framework decision, that very large 54-page decision, in the body of the decision, it recalls that parties can voluntarily report on loss and damage in their BTRs. And in the outline of the BTR report, it has a specific entry for that voluntary reporting. And then in the lengthy set of tables, I think 12 of those tables, the reporting tables, the common tabular formats, at least 12 of them have a footnote which provide the option for additional information to be provided on loss and damage. So there's a specific mention of loss and damage in each of those tables, which I think optically is really important. In the substa conclusions, on sources of input to the GST, included in the types of information that should be or could be provided under the GST is information pursuant to paragraph 6B of decision 19 CMA1, that's the Katowice GST decision, and that paragraph 6B includes loss and damage. So we're seeing that loss and damage, and I'm sure that's not all, but that I think in my mind those are the highlights. Seeing that loss and damage, from Article 8 in the Paris Agreement, and certainly from the work of the XCOM beginning in 2013, we're seeing that loss and damage is fingering through and being feathered through certainly the Paris Agreement ratchet mechanism, if that's what you want to call it. I do think that much more needs to be done, but it's out there, and there are levers to pull, and I think it's incumbent upon those of us who want to see progress made on loss and damage and the financing of loss and damage, et cetera, to really be aware of all the different areas where that envelope can be pushed. So that was sort of the outlining before we can determine whether a glass is half empty or half full. I think we need to know what's in the glass itself. And that was my attempt to show you that. The real issue that hasn't been decided upon over a number of years has been the governance of the Warsaw International Mechanism. Is it sole governance under the CMA, or does the COP maintain a role in governing the Warsaw International Mechanism? Currently, there's a broad divide between developing countries and developed countries on the issue. Developing countries taking the position that there should be a dual governance, and that the history and the role of the convention is a critical piece of that argument. And then the converse developed country view that the CMA has sole governance, and that was part of the delicate agreement made in Paris. So very different interpretations of the Paris Agreement, and certainly the continuing role of the convention in governing the WIM. Not having decided that, or been able to decide that first in Madrid formally, or in Glasgow won't stop work on loss and damage under the convention process. And so a number of parties, I think, were willing to let that conversation continue because work on loss and damage will continue under the XCOM, etc. I think what we need to think about strategically, and certainly from a developing country perspective, in terms of positive or proactive outcomes, certainly around financing for loss and damage, much less the provision of technical assistance on the ground, is how much has the failure to decide on the governance issue held back progress in other areas, and would a decision on governance free up parties to move? That's a personal question. I think that's a question that we all need to think about as we write about and ponder this governance issue, certainly from a legal perspective. So governance, even though things will move forward without having made that decision, is still out there, and I think it will eventually need to be resolved. The dialogue, again, I think was a disappointment in terms of its open-endedness, a real kind of lack of clarity on exactly what will be discussed. But I think the biannual assessment report, I think that certainly the report on determination of needs and those decisions and the outcomes of some of those decisions provide a source or a foundation for some of those dialogues or for that dialogue. And I would encourage the developing countries who want to make progress in those dialogues to consider some of the foundation material that's available out there. And I think that some of the open-endedness could certainly also be firmed up in the future. And I think that's something that parties may wish to consider, is how do we get our fingers and hands around this dialogue and make it more substantial. And I think there's a possibility of doing that. That is where I'm going to stop for now. I have many more thoughts, but this is the information I wanted to convey, and I hope that I can answer any questions that this has thrown up. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was a very thorough analysis, and I'm sure we will come back to some of the points that you've raised here, especially around the governance. I thought that was very interesting, and will be interesting to hear what those who have negotiated and advised think about this, and how important it is that this question is resolved before we can make more substantial progress. Now, because of the timing, and I know that Ami needs to leave earlier, would it be okay if you go first for a few minutes and then we go to Selam? Yeah, I'm here until we we fall off our chair. So I want to hear from all of you, but it's if that is okay with Selam. Yeah, okay. So then you will give you, because we can't compete with your super cute daughter.
Oh no, I'm sorry, my daughter. That's unexpected childcare. I apologize for bringing you.
No. So yes, and Amir. So for those of you who haven't met him now, and he's got two hats, very important ones. He's the associate director of CDP, and he's also the legal advisor of the LDCs, of the chair of the LDCs, in fact. So he knows exactly what's going on, and hopefully he will share some insights with us now. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, associate director of climate for CDP. I don't think anyone knows exactly what's going on. At least that's what I tell myself late at night, that there's no single person that knows every single element of the negotiations. And I think that's important because it's part of the trickery and the solution. I wanted to say, Linda, that was really fascinating. And if you don't mind at all sharing that sketch of where loss and damage goes through every decision, I would be incredibly grateful. I was thinking at length what I could possibly add to the vast knowledge that I know that Selam has of the negotiations and of a lot of the elements that I'm not nearly as expert as she is on, and to the overarching view that Dan presented at the beginning. And it occurs to me that the only direction to go with that is to expand a little bit on, instead of going into Article 6 and what happened precisely in terms of the negotiations, as I did in the morning session, to rather expand a little bit on the question that you asked, Petra, on creating legal obligations and different ways of doing that as it comes out of COP or CMA. And to do that, I will go a tiny little bit into the negotiations in Article 6. So for a very long time, the least developed countries, to a certain extent, or the EIG or different groups, whoever associated themselves with that, were fighting a battle on environmental integrity, in addition to the actual environmental integrity group. So they were fighting a lot of avoiding double counting and avoiding transfer of units and so on. And this COP, it was slightly different. While the fight was still there and the normal words were still there, it was explicitly said during informals and informal informals that we need to take into account that what we should do now is send enough signals up to the world outside of COP that they will be able to pick up on the differentiation between a good and a bad credit. I haven't been to every COP since COP1, but for the more than several that I've been to, I've never heard that type of explicit discussion repeated again and again. And I found it refreshing, not least of which because I work with CDP outside of the negotiations, but because it reflects a certain forward thinking. And I think Dan alluded to that. And what I wanted to do was to try and answer your question, Petra, again in a tone of hope at the morning in terms of legal obligations, but not of states. And I know that I'm not, since many of you are legal scholars, I know that I'm not going to be telling you things you don't know in terms of legal process. So forgive me for repeating things slowly, just because that's the way my mind works. What has happened to us, and I'm speaking for CDP and for the Science Based Target Initiative, who are tied at the hip, is that through COP decisions, through the IPCC report, through normalizing the concept of the SBTs, and through climate litigation, whether it's Agenda or any of the many, many others that are happening right now, and I'm sure that you're all aware of them, the idea of defining your future risk has been sharpened and honed. And we discovered that increasingly with corporations, whether or not they're legally bound by this, they are legally bound to disclose. So TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Change Disclosure, Financial Climate Related Risk Disclosure, sort of set that very much in our mind that even financially, you are at a risk if you don't adhere to best practices that take into account what future thought would be. The simplest 19th century tables of risk have just been updated in accordance to this science. And to that sense, they've been integrated, I think, into law, but I'm willing to accept that definitely into very strong normative expectations. So to me, at least, in that context, the very peripheral argument that didn't happen in COP26 and did happen in COP25 and in COP24 about welcoming or not welcoming the IPCC report is a very significant step. The completely welcoming the results in the other 4 paragraphs, if I'm not mistaken, where the science is elaborated on and increased and expressed, have a massive impact in most of the world and the way that it reads legal obligations or normative obligations outside of the UNFCCC process. And I think that in itself is a massive impact. And that impact turns around and goes inside into the UNFCCC negotiations themselves, in my mind, and I'm very happy to be corrected. When discussing things now, parties are very careful of the wording that they use because they are aware of the fact that normative wording is now used in court cases. But more importantly, other parties, the least developed countries as well, but ILAC leading amongst them, and I don't think I'm revealing anything that was not known in the room, are willing to give up a lot as long as it's clearly signposted. So I've come to the same conclusion that there is a limit of how much you can expect the UNFCCC to achieve. Not out of resignation, but rather out of an understanding of the process encompasses much more than those 20%. And there's all the percentages around, and let's start working with them hand in hand. And it feels very much like if COP26 had one exceptionally good result, it is that passing of the baton explicitly to other bodies, which doesn't mean that we aren't facing an endless mess ahead, which doesn't mean that we aren't facing a situation in which the atmosphere is going to suffer, in which bad interpretations will overrule. But it's definitely a clearer signal than there was before. And that clear signal, and I think we've all experienced this in our personal life, means that now a lot of private sector actors have both more, I guess, confidence to act. Media has more of an understanding, and civil society of where to start looking. So GFANZ, the Mark Carney Glasgow Financial Asset Managers Net Zero. I'm terrible with what the acronyms stand for, but I think we all know what they stand for in this particular instance, has been criticized, and rightly. It's gone through what we could consider as an aggressive MEL process from the moment it was conceived, to see where there are weaknesses and where private sector actors could actually avoid any of these solutions. And now we've come to take for granted that you're a terrible company if you don't at least set a net zero target. And to be honest now, the issue is, and I might be in a minority, but I've heard two great people today say this as well, it's probably inevitable that we'll reach 1.5 aligned pledges. But the question has never been the pledges, but they are just a stepping stone. Now the question is, do we reach 1.5 aligned actions on the ground? And that is far beyond the remit of the UNFCCC. And that is where we need to turn our attention. And now the UNFCCC in COP27, 28, 29, potentially not in 30, where the global stocktake might create other results, are going to just have to help those processes. One of them that I'd turn all of our attention to is within the technical texts of Article 6, there is that the Substa needs to consider whether or not to count avoidance under its issuance of credits. Itself a massive question, and I've been invited since COP ended, which is not that long ago, to 2 calls with private companies trying to sell offsets and having just that discussion of that sentence with attempts to influence that subsection of the cover decision of, I think it's 6.2. I can't shamedly remember off by heart if it's 6.2 or 4. So I can't remember if it's 6.4, the supervisory body has to consider that. If it's 6.2, I think the Substa has to, but it needs to be considered at this stage. So those are just a few notes on the transition from COP, but thanks to COP, and I hope they make sense. I'm happy to stay for 5 minutes to answer questions, although I feel that people here can answer them very, very well without me, and I apologize in advance that I'm speaking and leaving and blaming my daughter for that, for as long as she can't answer back and say that it's not her fault.
Thank you very much, Ami. I know you've got the best of excuses, and thank you for coming twice. So it's really appreciated. Very, very important to have these insights. Because of the timing, I think I would like to move straight to Selam now, and then we can have questions and more answers after that, perhaps. So now, thank you again, Selam, for coming here, and you've given an extremely helpful and insightful lecture already in the series, and you know that prompted already discussions with the embassies, you know that. So Selam is an international environmental law expert, and she works as legal advisor to the African group of negotiators, and she really covers all of the issues, isn't it? You know everything. So that is so great to have you here. And she's really in the depth of all of these issues as well. But she's also an academic scholar. She's a Leverhulme doctoral scholar in climate justice at the University of Reading. So she combines both of these aspects, which is absolutely perfect. And I'm very interested now to hear your thoughts, Selam. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for this great discussion and for the invitation again. I'm not sure if I know everything, but I'll try. I'll try to share my thoughts as Dan has done, and also Linda, by trying to see the bigger picture and also maybe focusing specifically on adaptation. as we've been saying, it was one of the issues that has been left out since we had the Paris Agreement in 2015. Maybe to start, I also joined briefly the discussion in the morning, which was also very interesting, and in particular about there was questions about the role of the governing arrangement, what the COP does, what the CMA does, the process of how we are heading to raising ambition. Is it fair? Is it just? Those questions were reflected in the morning discussion. So maybe I would also try to think about that and maybe reflect it in the discussion around adaptation in particular. As I think Linda also mentioned, the covering decisions have been used under the UNFCCC process to either remind parties of previous decision, recalling previous mandates, reiterating invitation for either it could be communication of obligation from parties. But this year we have seen that there has been an interest of including new elements, for example, including elements that have not been discussed under the UNFCCC as parties, but processes that have been taken into account, where of course would address climate change, but not necessarily directly related to the UNFCCC process, and with no clarity on how we get reports on this action. So it was important to really, from the first day, to really see that there was of interest even in the agenda item submissions. For example, the African group submitted an agenda item request on the operationalizing of global goal on adaptation. This has been a submission that has been made, I think, for the last 4 years. Since the Paris Agreement, the African group has been repeatedly submitting a request for an agenda item on global goal for adaptation. Not necessarily only that, but also the role of the Standing Committee on Finance. Is the COP going to continue that discussion of giving mandate to the SCF, the Standing Committee on Finance, or not? The consideration of special circumstances of African countries have been some of the submissions that have been made. So there was a political interest of how we even agree on the agenda. The other important elements when we were heading to COP was raising ambition, right? So ambition on mitigation, ambition on adaptation, and ambition on means of implementation. This has been a call by developing countries, and also this was actually reflected by the COP presidency themselves to really make sure that we have ambition on these 3 elements. So following on Dan's maybe way of grading, I'm not very good at it, but I'll try to, after explaining what has happened at COP in my view, and also maybe reflecting perspective of the African countries and also developing countries to some extent, would share my scoring if that's possible. On the preambular decisions of the COP and the CMA board, it was important that the recognition of international cooperation was pushed. Non-state actors was pushed in particular by civil societies, rightly, as they're also sharing their efforts on addressing climate change. But it was also important for parties that the multilateral process under the UNFCCC is maintained, as this has a guiding principles, right? So parties under the UNFCCC urge for enhancing that multilateralism, as there is clarity on the principles of how countries take this obligation, tracking of the targets that have been submitted. There are clear reporting mechanisms under the UNFCCC, and even a process to follow up on action, Article 15. The committee, the Paris Agreement Compliance Committee, if there is a need, this committee could follow up on efforts of parties. So the enhancing of multilateral process was in the 3 elements: mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. Then maybe speaking on the linking science and urgency, there was a discussion on how science could inform not only the temperature goal, which is critically important for addressing climate action, but also the progress on adaptation, having more scientific knowledge around adaptation, including understanding the global goal was important, but also linking it to progression and urgency should be linked to the support, both mitigation support or adaptation support. With that, there were language even proposed by the African group to call that science and urgency paragraph into science and equity, so that science can inform what action is needed and equity could inform parties' efforts. So linking that and taking into account of different perspectives, the language we have now in the covering decision is one, there is a need to enhance ambition and action, and that has to be relating to mitigation, adaptation, and finance. And as I have provided in the Global Goal for Adaptation lecture, countries can take more ambitious efforts on adaptation, and this has to be taken into account when enhancing NDC. So this is something that African countries will be doing. We have seen a lot of NDCs that are from developing countries where they have enhanced their adaptation efforts, as they're already paying a lot of resources from their own governments to enhance adaptation. So recognition of enhancing adaptation is also a critical factor that has been reflected in this covering decision. When I specifically come to adaptation and how the decisions have operationalized the global goal on adaptation, the first achievement, if we can say that, is the global goal for adaptation and adaptation itself having an agenda item under the CME. So this is a big win that has come maybe 6 years delayed, because this was a request that was submitted even in 2016 when we for the first time agreed the CME agenda. It was very specific in saying matters relating to mitigation, matters relating to adaptation, and matters relating to finance, so that we actually advance and progress on all these three goals. But it has come now, so we'll take that and work around the work program that it has established. So a 2-year work program has been established. Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program, as you have seen it from the decision. It would have workshops, submission from parties, including non-state, non-parties to the UNFCCC, and then finally there will be a reporting back to the CMA itself, which is important in following up the progress, giving political guidance annually. So that has been established. Maybe to specifically highlight some of the key elements on why the global goal for adaptation has been important for many developing countries, and some of the language that has been reflected on the decision is it's important that we see this goal as enhancing adaptation action and support. Further, there is importance in understanding how the global goal for adaptation could be operationalized. So now the decision provides that we need to operationalize it, including to understand methodologies on how we assess needs. Indicators, are there going to be specific indicators on how we reach towards this goal? Do we need further data and metrics? So that metrics need to be agreed under the UNFCCC process to make it more measurable. And also the last is needs and support needed to achieve it. So this is another critical element where this could inform, for example, the new goal under the Paris Agreement. So all these elements that have been a key ask from developing countries have been reflected in the decision. So it's about how we operationalize it. Another important recognition is its role in informing the global stocktake processes. So a clarity on how the information coming from adaptation communications, it could be a single document as adaptation communication or through the national determined contribution of countries, as most developing countries have done it. So by having a clear 2-year plan with workshops or submissions, we can say that the global goal for adaptation has been now initiated. So the decision even provides that the initiation is just after the conclusion of the CMA3. So from January on, there are submissions that parties need to be making, thinking about how to organize the workshops. And as you have heard in the final plenary, there has been already 2 offers to host the first workshops, one from Egypt and also Maldives. So it will be interesting on how we see this momentum being built and carried through to CMA4 in Sharm el-Sheikh. On financing on adaptation, there has been pledge that had been made to the Adaptation Fund. I'm not sure if you have seen the figure, but it's around 350 million. So one could argue that this is a welcomed pledge, but it's very insignificant when you compare it even to the 100 billion, which is less than something 3.5 or percentage of that. So we still need to have that balance between mitigation and adaptation support, because the decision around the provisions of support under the COP, under the CMA, provides that there is a need to make sure that the balance between mitigation and adaptation is achieved. But the BA, the biennial assessment by the Standing Committee on Finance, clearly indicate that the resources provided for adaptation are much less than mitigation. There is also a language around where developed countries are urged to double their collective provision for climate finance, in particular to adaptation. This is an important and welcomed paragraph, but it's also linked to address this gap that I have just mentioned, because there is already a remaining gap for resources for adaptation. So this collective urging of developed countries to collectively double that provision of finance is something that would be important for developing countries in meeting their targets. On finance, this has been something that has been already touched on this morning, but mostly the finance discussion under the COP, the different subsidiary bodies has been limited to a more procedural kind of outcomes, right? Procedures are equally important in the UNFCCC, but there was an expectation that there will be a lot of pledges coming in, but as I have mentioned, the amount, the 350 million for Adaptation Fund and around 600 something million for the Least Developed Countries Fund was the actual pledge that has been submitted under the UNFCCC process. Another procedural decision, which again is very important, is the decision under the Paris Agreement, the CMA, on the new goal for climate finance, which again reiterated the importance of increasing mitigation efforts, enhancing resilience, and making sure the balance between adaptation and mitigation is also reflected in this new goal. The clarity around the quality, quantity, and the scope is also something that has been reflected. But as you have heard, there has been some aspirational goals. For example, African ministers requested that annual goal to be 1.3 trillion. On the basis of the needs assessment report. So this figure was not a random figure, but the need assessment report provides that 6 trillion, as we just have been discussing, 6 trillion is needed. So 1.3 annually as an aspirational goal to define this goal was something that the African countries asked, but have fallen short from the decision. But the new goal, the process on how to achieve it has been achieved. Maybe one final thought on equity, as this is also something that is an area of interest, and also something that the African countries pushed for an understanding on how it could be operationalized, is maybe important to share. As Dan has said, operationalizing equity has been one of the challenges under the UNFCCC. So this year, for the first time, just transition that was reflected under the Paris Agreement now is reflected as just transition in a plural sense, plural. So it's a just transitions. We have understood that just transition, linking it to creating of jobs, transitioning of these jobs to more greener jobs. But for the African group, we made a clear submission, and this has been also something that our ministers clearly shared during the decision, the covering decision language, where just transitions has to be in a plural sense reflected, and just transition is now a link to promotion of sustainable development, eradication of poverty. Of course, it is again linked to, it could be linked to creation of decent work, quality of jobs are reflected. But another important element is just transition is now linked to also making financial flows consistent with the pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and resilient development pathways. So it's also important to reflect this kind of critical elements that might not have been really highlighted in the different platforms. So the understanding of transitioning long-term strategies, because the CMA established a clear work program on mitigation, as we have been saying and discussing. So that just transition, linking it to financial flows, is also an important element to consider. And this is also something that has been reflected in paragraph 32 of the CMA, where some of the more attention has been given in particular to the phase out and phase down debate we had at the last plenary. But even in such kind of efforts of countries, there has to be a consideration of how we would transit into a more low emissions economy, and also recognizing the need to support the poorest, most vulnerable, recognizing there will be a support need for just transition was something that has been called for. I think with that, I can end my thoughts. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Selam. That was really interesting. I noticed actually this change in the just transition to just transitions, and to have this context now, that's absolutely fundamental in understanding why the change has occurred. And I think the entire concept has changed with that. And also who holds the power to define the concept, perhaps. So that's really, really interesting. I don't want to jump ahead with my question, but if I don't see any other hands raised, I will actually ask one question for Selam, if I may, and that concerns really Article 6 and maybe the context of adaptation finance and the share of proceeds of funds. How do you evaluate what has been achieved under Article 6.2 and 6.4 in the context of adaptation finance, but also any other points maybe that you think you would like to share about Article 6 and the rule book. Thank you.
Thank you. I purposely didn't include the discussion around Article 6 because one of the key asks, I think this is shared by most developing countries, G77 as a whole, where there was a call for clarity on adaptation financing from this market mechanisms, right? But the language that now we have is very voluntary. And I think the first reaction from most developing countries was this was a language which is much lower down than the Madrid language that we have on Article 6.2, where there was actually clarity on how the share of proceeds would be transferred to the adaptation fund. So now I think that was one of the key disappointments, where we don't know the amount of money that's going to be generated from Article 6. That's the first uncertainty, but to not really know the amount for sure is something else, where it was much clearer with the Kyoto Protocol, where the 2% of share of proceeds directly go to the adaptation fund. But now even how the market would play out with much of the voluntary arrangements is one of the key questions. And the second is, even then, the second element of that, units contributing to the adaptation fund is voluntary. So it doesn't really hold a strong legal basis to argue that, resources would be coming to the adaptation fund from Article 6.2. There is a language around Article 6.4, but one of the fear is this article will not have a lot of activities, will not have a lot of traction from parties that might want to engage on it. So that was, if you have seen that during the last plenary, this was one of the actually political asks from the African ministers. The African minister, the African group was represented by Gabon, the Republic of Gabon. So the minister asked a question on really saying, can you give us a political pledge? Because we wanted to make sure at that last plenary, the rules for the Paris Agreement are achieved. So we want to make sure that the process and the implementation of Article 6 begins, but not at the cost of not knowing how the resources for adaptation come. But that even political reassurance that was asked in the plenary, if you have seen the response from the developed country partners, was not really strong as many have wished for. So that's one could call it a disappointment, in particular for adaptation financing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, there's certainly an issue around the predictability of the finance flows, isn't it? If you don't exactly know how lively this mechanism will be. That's really interesting, and so much to reflect upon when reading these rules. Are there any other questions? I can't see any, and I don't want to extend this simply because I still have some questions. So I think we probably have to make plans for the next year in how we continue this discussion and bringing in these different views, which I think is really, really useful for our research, but also for any political activities, and perhaps also for advising governments. So thank you again to our speakers, Linda and Selam, for your great contributions, and I'm really grateful you've taken the time. I know it's a Friday afternoon, and a special Friday. I've realized that quite late. And thank you also to the audience. And this will again be recorded, and we will follow up in 2022. So thank you again.